Good evening, everybody. Apparently we're broadcasting. I can't see you, so I'm at a distinct disadvantage, but I'm going to crack on and hope you can see me. Welcome to Comprehensive Futures webinar. It's for the Comprehensive Futures we decided to put together a webinar to kind of celebrate the party conferences which weren't happening. All right. Tonight, it's the policy vacuum. Is selective education a no-go area for our political parties? We've got 4 great speakers to give different views for us. I'm going to kick off and introduce you to the panel. Just so you know, I'm the chair, I'm Nuala Burgess, and I also chair Comprehensive Future. So our panel tonight, Christine Blower, Labour peer. Now, Christine was the first woman to be voted General Secretary of the NUT. She's also a former, and obviously, General Secretary of the NUT, and is a patron of Comprehensive Future. Nigel Jones will speak next. He's chair of the Liberal Democrat Education Association. He's a former school teacher and FE lecturer, and currently a school governor for both a secondary and a primary school. And Vix Lowthian is the Green Party education spokesperson. Now, Vix lives on the Isle of Wight, where she's a secondary school teacher and teaches no less than 4 subjects at A-level: history, classics, geology, and a module of sociology. It's pretty impressive, Vix. Welcome. Now, our final guest, he is, we understand, on his way beetling up the M25 as I speak, is Steve Mastin. He's the former president and now vice president of the Conservative Education Society. Steve taught at secondary level for 70 years and is now an education consultant. Right, quick bit of housekeeping. Questions, please do put your questions in. Put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box. And we are encouraging people, if they want to vote for them or upvote for them. There's a little thumbs up icon. And if you like a question, you can click that button and we'll get the idea. And if it's really popular, we'll fire it at the panelists. We have been sent in a number of good questions in advance, but if a question gets a lot of votes, I'll definitely be tempted to, as I say, chuck it at the panelists. I'm going to be quiet now. I'm going to introduce our very first speaker. We're really grateful to her for coming this evening, Christine Blower. Many thanks.
Nuala, thank you very much. And I am absolutely delighted to join this distinguished panel to discuss what I think is a much under-discussed subject. I am indeed a Labour member of the House of Lords, but I'm not a frontbencher and I'm not part of the education team. So therefore, I feel entirely free to speak on my own behalf rather than on behalf of the party, although obviously I will say some things about the Labour Party. And I think that I have also had quite a long association with Comprehensive Future, both from my days, which Nuala, the chair, mentioned as General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, and I am delighted now to be a patron. So I think that lays out where my views probably come from before I even start to speak. And we've got very good panelists, so I'm not going to try and cover the whole area. So if you think, why didn't she say that? You'll probably hear it from one of the next panelists. So let me start by saying that I feel that the Labour Party has indeed failed to grasp the nettle of the 11 plus and grammar schools in a general sense. It's an unresolved policy issue, I think, in the Labour Party. And it's always interesting, I think, to reflect that more local authorities went comprehensive under Margaret Thatcher than any other parliamentary leader of any kind. And I do think in some respects that Tony Blair's much vaunted education position meant that he sometimes adopted slightly odd positions in relation to some aspects of policy. And I take the view that when he talked about standards rather than structures, it was actually code for saying, we're not going to deal with grammar schools. Because frankly, we ended up with more structures than you could shake a stick at under New Labour, but we still had grammar schools. So it's definitely an area that I think the Labour Party hasn't addressed in the way that it might have done. I'm just going to make three rather quick points in my contribution to this discussion this evening. They are going to be the success of the comprehensive school sector, selective education and social justice, and the need to get rid of the selective schools expansion fund. So let me start by first of all referring to the excellent study in the name of Dr. Nuala Burgess, our chair this evening, A Tale of Two Counties. It compares school performance in selective Buckinghamshire and comprehensive Hampshire. And I commend it to you thoroughly because it's a very well-researched piece of work and it's a thoroughly good read. But I am going to confine myself to just two short paragraphs from the introduction. Nuala writes, in Hampshire, parents champion their county's non-selective system. Their illuminating accounts describe schools where able-bodied and disabled students, high flyers, and children with learning difficulties all learn to rub along together in comprehensive schools, many of them rated outstanding. Such first-hand accounts are backed up with official statistics which show that the stellar academic performance claimed by Buckinghamshire is limited to a handful of schools and comes at great cost to the education of the majority of children. A comparison of GCSE attainment for Buckinghamshire and Hampshire shows that moderate and low attainers perform far better in Hampshire's comprehensive schools. So I think if we're talking about education as a public good, then you couldn't really have a better testimonial than that for comprehensive schools. So selective education, I now come to my second point, which is about the kind of inherent unfairness of selective education. I genuinely believe it is unfair and therefore a matter of social justice. When I describe the 11 plus to educationalists from jurisdictions all over the place, as I've had occasion to in the international work I did from the National Union of Teachers, their response is often, why don't you call that system rejection rather than selection? Because for the majority, that's precisely what it is, it's rejection. So to pass the 11 plus, we know that you very often need additional tutoring, additional coaching, additional support. And it's clear that a pass-fail exam for a 10-year-old, because that's what most of them are, even though it's called 11 plus, with distinctly disadvantages many groups, working class children, less affluent children, and probably a number of BME students whose families simply cannot afford to provide that kind of additional private tuition. But the other issue about the 11 plus is the creation of the idea of failure in the minds of 10-year-olds. Because even if they could all afford to pay for the tuition, they simply couldn't all pass. Some of them are bound to fail. And it's simply not reasonable to be doing that to so many 10-year-olds. And I would just like to say that, as I said earlier in relation to Hampshire, Hampshire's comprehensive system does much better in GCSE attainment for low and moderate achievers. Now, I'm not saying that all the children who pass are all very high achievers, because ultimately there may not be. But there is a key issue here, and I'm also not saying that all of the children who go to comprehensive schools are low and moderate attainers. Some of them are indeed high flyers. But it's much fairer in Hampshire that all children get a decent crack of the whip. So it's really important that when we compare ourselves with the best achieving and internationally renowned education systems, that we look at what they do. And of course, Finland is very often thought of as being one of the most high performing systems. And it has no such pass-fail cliff edge for 10-year-olds. So young kids are going into the secondary phase of their education without that sense that they are in any way second class. My third point is this. Theresa May had a very peculiar fondness for grammar schools. And so was created the Selective Secondary Expansion Fund in order to create more secondary school places, more grammar schools, if you like, by the back door. And a key condition for receiving that funding for capital projects was that, that the grammar school should take in more children who are eligible for pupil premium. Now, we could have a long discussion about pupil premium. We could have a discussion about how it's targeted. We could have a discussion about how well it's used, but it is what it is. And the fact is, it was a criterion for receiving that money from that particular fund. And the numbers demonstrate that actually in grammar schools, there are now fewer children who are in receipt of or who are eligible for pupil premium. So the fact is that that hasn't worked as a lever to make grammar schools change their intake. In fact, they've remained pretty much exactly the same. And of course, you won't be surprised to know that no sanctions were applied to schools who had taken the money, agreed to take more students, and then haven't actually taken them. So in summary, colleagues, I think that one of the things, my view is that that fund should be therefore reabsorbed into the DFE, and it should be used for the generality of schools, because we all know how desperately underfunded schools are. So in summary, colleagues, education as a human and civil right and a public good is best delivered, as we now say, through comprehensive schools. No child should be made to feel a failure at 10. And I don't believe that most educationalists would invent this system if we hadn't had it wished upon us by generations previously. The future, colleagues, of education is comprehensive. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, Christine, thank you very much. Before I turn to Nigel, just very quickly, just something there. I hope everyone who's tweeting can pick up Christine's little punch there, rejection rather than selection. Sorry, I just had to get that in. Nigel, thank you.
Thank you. Can I just say as an introduction that a few years ago I proposed a motion at our party conference opposing the government's plans to expand grammar schools. And that was, of course, overwhelmingly passed. And since then, a number of people have actually indicated that maybe we should go even further and say now is the time to actually get rid of the few grammar schools that do exist at the moment and replace them with something better. But that's something we may well debate fairly soon within our party. I want to look at some of the thinking and concepts that lie behind the issues involved in this. Beginning with the term social mobility, which I hesitate actually to be too enthusiastic myself about the use of that phrase, because it's often used in a very narrow meaning that you should provide opportunities for people from lower social classes so that they can become high achievers in education and subsequent careers if they have the ability, and that's all. Now, given our society, it seems that by definition, that really means that it's only for a few. And the consequence of that is that you then propose that you separate those with this potential, or at least some people say it is, that you separate those with this potential from those who do not. And a process, of course, that requires testing, usually at the age of 11. And those tests have long been seen to be unreliable. It doesn't actually provide a safe way of assessing the potential of youngsters at that particular age. When the 11+ exams were the norm, quite a few people showed later in life that those tests that they did at 11 bore no relationship to their actual ability and potential. And in some cases, it only took a year or two for that to reveal itself. So what about those who never had the chance to show this and develop their ability because of the segregation that took place in those days? And what about those who can't compete with the children of parents who pay private tuition to pass the exam? So it's unfair, as Christine said. But even if a fair system could be established, all-embracing division at the age of 11 sends a damaging message about how we value, or rather don't value, all our children. Another concept which I have some doubts about is the concept of choice that's often bandied about. it's often found that parents actually fancy selective systems. And I understand how some of them can get very excited about the possibility of their children getting selected for a grammar school. Schools branded excellence due to their high exam results, having selected, of course, to ensure they get those exam results. And I would say to those parents, do not be deceived. The majority of your children will not benefit from a selective policy. It's like saying to parents, you have a choice between the best school or a second best school, and we will make that choice for you by testing your child. Sam Friedman, a former government advisor on education to Michael Gove, and he has written, and I quote, "Selective schools destroy choice. As a parent, I don't want a shot at a good school place, I want a guarantee, and that is impossible in a system with selective schools." Parents often don't realize that the existence of selective schools can actually cause harm to those who don't get in. Stephen Gorard, Professor of Education at Durham, says, there is repeated evidence, not just one or two bits of evidence, but repeated evidence that any appearance of advantage for those attending selective schools, and there are some advantages for a tiny number, yes, but that advantage, he says, is outweighed by the disadvantage for those who do not. Again, in January this year, Oxford Economic Papers printed a report by a team of researchers entitled, "Do Selective Schooling Systems Increase Inequality?" And their research was on a very large scale and included not only the effects of selection on educational achievement, but on people's lives later into jobs, careers, and earnings. And the answer to their question, they said, is yes. Selective schooling, I quote, "selective schooling systems do appear to increase inequality." Not just not solve it, but increase it. What is more, selective systems will reinforce inequalities across generations. They say the grammar schools do some good for a small number of children, but the existence of grammar schools do harm to other children. And that is so true in today's circumstances. Long gone are the days when secondary modern pupils could walk into a job with few qualifications or skills. And the researchers suggest one factor is that more academic teachers and the more highly skilled ones tend to gravitate to the grammar schools. Another factor they suggest is the peer mix, because grammar schools are heavily skewed to better off and more motivated parents. And that is confirmed, as Christine mentioned, that is confirmed in recent analysis of the attempts by this government to get more disadvantaged children into grammar schools, and attempts which seem to have completely failed. And similar findings occur across the world. OECD finds that countries with selective education are more socioeconomically segregated than those with comprehensive systems. And 90% of the best education systems in the world are comprehensive. And that includes Shanghai, by the way, which our government people are often so wanting to quote. Selection by ability in this way means dividing people into just two categories. And this is a point that I feel very, very strongly about. Yes, we need to keep assessing our children, but when you assess them and then say, right, you're in one category and you're in the other, in a way that actually affects their years of education and often the rest of their lives. Children have a huge range of aptitudes and abilities in different subjects, different life experiences, different skills at different times in their personal development. So what a terribly crude way of assessing them. Given what we now know about how social environments affect people's personal development, it is also a highly ignorant way of assessing and dividing people. Labeling people in their wholeness in such a simplistic way is to treat them as less than human. Comprehensive schooling, on the other hand, means flexible learning, suited to each person's varied and varying abilities and aptitudes. But please note, it does not mean teaching them all the same. One doesn't hear that quite so much these days, but when I started my teaching career, I was quite annoyed at the way in which some people often used to say, we're a comprehensive school, therefore we teach them all the same. It's not. That's not, as I say, it's because within the comprehensive system, you have the degree of flexibility, if you use it right, to give the varied teaching to the varied interests of each pupil. Now, what we're talking about, finally, I want to say, matters not only to the lives of individuals, it matters to society. Our economy requires improved quality of education and skills for everyone. And our cultural life together requires everyone to be suitably educated and valued. So does our democracy as well requires this, if it is not to degenerate into people making ignorant choices, or even worse, a divide between the privileged rulers versus the servants. If social mobility means anything, it means everyone should have improved quality of life, making a good contribution to society and earning a good living, whether or not they move into these so-called higher professional jobs and roles. A crude, selective schooling system does not fit with that aim. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Great message there. Selective schools spoil school choice. Right, okay, and our next speaker tonight is Vix, and giving us the Green Party perspective. Thank you very much, Vix. Vix Lowthian.
Thank you. Thank you, Nuala. It's always a pleasure to set out the Green Party policy, particularly on education, because our policies have consistently remained bold and progressive in a range of issues, although there's always room for improvement. I've been education spokesperson since 2016, and tonight I officially become a member of the National Executive for the Green Party. It's a very busy evening and a very exciting time for the party. This weekend is also the start of our party conference, where usually I speak at fringe meetings with the NEU and with the Young Greens and the Anti-Academy Alliance. So it's great to add a comprehensive future to the family. The secondary modern school were created in those areas that are clinging onto this 11+. And they should be consigned to history. The tripartite system of education with an academic strand was phased out in most areas in 1976, before I was even born. And yet, through the powerful forces of misplaced nostalgia, political inertia, over-optimistic parenting, as Nigel, protection of privilege, and bare-faced stubbornness, at the age of 44 on Tuesday, I am still campaigning for its end. And I think this misplaced nostalgia in a political and a cultural climate that brought us Brexit and harks back to empire and World War II and the 1966 World Cup, the English affection for grammar schools still holds strong. Whether that's the uniform, the austere teachers, traditional subjects, the rigour, this vision, English grammar school is a beacon for many, a public school standard of education to reward the most able. And thousands of parents buy into this belief that their child will be one to attend the local grammar. The reality, as grammars generate hundreds of secondary moderns of 11-year-olds already feeling to have failed, is unsurprisingly not on the brochures. Political parties and campaigning groups and parents and teachers can win this rational argument that Nigel so clearly set out about the consequences of creating secondary moderns, but without changing this culture of nostalgia generated by the Daily Mail and such, we are fighting against the tide. As an aside, both my parents passed the 11+ in 1959, and they attended their respective grammars. My father eventually becoming a council tenant farmer, and my mum a legal secretary. But my dad hated his time at grammar school and has very few friends from that time. But his mum was the one who's very proud, and she read the Daily Express. The optimistic parents also support grammar schools because they aspire to getting their child to pass and be admitted. But we know that increasingly this optimism is only as deep as the pockets that will pay for tutors, or as optimistic as the previous numbers of exams and qualifications that the parents themselves achieved. My good friend up north has spent long time attempting to prepare her 9-year-old son for sitting his 11+ in a university this month. Her optimism is now replaced by dogged realism. Political inertia on this matter is a source of my personal frustration, and it drew me to the Green Party. Politicians continue to pay lip service to the difficult issue, but they never take it by the horns. The Green Party policy on selective education is very clear, and not just the policy on grammar schools, although our grammar school policy is no new grammars and to integrate all of the existing ones into a comprehensive system with mixed ability teaching as learning as far as possible. But it's also our values that say it is counterproductive to select by aptitude, ability or social class. And that's a reminder that selective education is not just via the 11+. That's only one method of selective education that we must fight. It's tests at 11, it's tests at 16, it's tests at 7, even 4 years old, through privilege of postcode, those who can afford the uniform, who can afford the music lessons, religion, gender, ability to travel, and then university selection. We must tackle all selection on prior attainment and privilege. So to end, is selective education a no-go area for political parties? As a Green, I say absolutely not. We will never tackle the big issues of privilege, of social mobility, of creativity and opportunity unless we elect politicians at all levels, including councils, House of Commons, and indeed an elected House of Lords, who have the courage to not only end the divisive selective education system, but to put forward a truly comprehensive vision of education that will bring our country together. And right now, we really need to work together, especially on this issue. Thank you.
Wonderful, Vix. Thank you very much indeed. And actually, all credit to you. I think the Greens, I'm absolutely sure, please someone fire in a question. I think you are the only party to have a written policy on grammar schools and how you do it. So absolute bravo from us for that. Thanks, Vix. Nice personal touch there too. I like your stories. I'm coming to Steve. Steve, obviously you raced up the M25 and you made it. It's absolutely great to see you. Steve Mastin, off you go.
Nuala, thank you very much indeed. In fact, I've raced up from a state secondary school in Kent, and because it's not a grammar school, it is by default a secondary modern. And it's frustrating that people who think that the reintroduction of a grammar school system will not result in secondary moderns just haven't thought it through, that by implication, if you cream off the top 20% of pupils from a school to go to a grammar school, then the 80% that you leave behind are in a secondary modern. Now, I'm in favour of grammar schools for 6 reasons. The first reason that I'm in favour of grammar schools is that I favour a broad, academic, traditional curriculum for all pupils, no matter ability, no matter background, no matter socio-economic family circumstances. I want them to study history, geography, maths, the sciences. I don't want them to be hived off into other forms of curriculum that will actually disadvantage them when it comes to their working life. The second reason I'm in favour of grammar schools is because I think children should have pride in their school uniforms. They should have pride in their appearance. Grammar schools have always fostered this. It's an important lesson in life. The third is behaviour. Warm, strict behaviour, strict discipline. Children know what the rules are. Children like rules, and once they know what those parameters are, children thrive inside them. The fourth reason I'm in favour of grammar schools is because I believe in exam rigour. That is not testing constantly, but when exams are sat, you know that the exams are serious, teachers take them seriously, parents take the results seriously, and children know that the exams are serious. The fifth reason I'm in favour is no excuses for underachievement. Disadvantage is not an excuse for underachievement. Socioeconomic background is not an excuse for underachievement. So no excuses for underachievement is the fifth reason. And the final reason I'm in favour of grammar schools is because I believe all children, no matter their background, no matter their ability, should be pushed, should be stretched, should be encouraged. Now, slightly disingenuously, I am opposed to grammar schools, but the 6 reasons I gave you for being in favour of grammar schools is I believe that every single school should be a grammar school, in the sense that every single school should have those 6 things. I believe passionately in a broad traditional curriculum for every single child, not the fewer than 5% that go to grammar schools today. I believe in good traditional school uniforms, however they look, but that schools should take pride in them and pupils should take pride in them, and that school uniforms should be worn properly. I believe in strict behaviour, warm, strict behaviour, nurturing behaviour, but discipline that is very clear. I believe in rigorous exams for all children, no matter what ability, no excuses for underachievement, and that all children should be pushed and stretched. By pushing and stretching, what I mean by that is something very specific. I'll give you an example from a subject that we don't think of very often as a subject that sets or streams. And after all, that's what grammar schools, for the people who propose grammar schools and speak so highly in favour of them, tend to think of, are schools that set and stream and stretch their little Jemimas or their little Jeremies or whoever they are. And so they want their children to go to grammar schools thinking that they are more likely to be stretched and challenged if they go to a grammar school than if they go to a comprehensive state school. But actually, if you think of a subject like PE, PE is a subject where a lot of people think that just children muck in and they're all mixed ability. Well, a school that I taught in for 17 years had a head of PE who stretched, challenged, and definitely set pupils from the moment they started PE in year 7. He knew that a lot of children were put off PE by being not very good at sport, or so they thought. And so, of course, those children, age 11, were thrown in with the 11-year-olds who played rugby for the local rugby club and had been playing rugby, like I had done since I was 7. And so when you have children age 11 who've never picked up a rugby ball playing with children who are the local scrum half and have been since age 7, their experience of rugby is frightening, and that will put them off rugby for the rest of their life. So this head of PE, who setted and streamed, made sure that children who had probably never handled a rugby ball before were playing with similar pupils, and therefore they learned ball handling skills. And the children that had been playing for the local rugby club since they were 7 were playing rugby with others who knew how to play rugby. Consequently, all children had a very good experience of sport and developed at their own pace, at their own level, but nevertheless, every single child was stretched and challenged. Grammar schools is one of those things that comes up in my party, the Conservative Party, every so often. But I've got to say, it's a bit like the death penalty. You will find some people in the Conservative Party that want to bring back the death penalty. Personally, I don't know many, but you'll find a handful. Likewise, you'll find some Conservatives that think that the answer to everything is to bring back the grammar schools, or to bring back matron, or whatever the latest thing is that the Daily Mail is talking about. But fundamentally, my party's policy is crystal clear. There is not going to be a return to grammar schools. There will not be a return to the 11+. I'm not entirely sure what the argument is about. If it's about the abolition of the existing grammar schools, then I kind of understand that. However, How many pupils actually go to grammar schools? Is that around 5%? There was a report recently conducted by the Education Select Committee. Fewer than 5% of pupils attend grammar schools. 75% of local authorities in England have no grammar schools. So we are talking about a minority of a minority of a minority. Now for me, that's still too many. As I say, I was in Kent today. I was working with all staff across a multi-academy trust. All of them were state secondary schools. All of them were what we would call comprehensive schools. However, they're in a county that has grammar schools. And so of course, that affects the pupil composition in those schools. It also affects the attraction of teachers to work in that school. So yes, of course, in a county like Buckinghamshire or Kent or Lincolnshire, there are serious effects that the grammar school system still has. But I would say that my party's policy is very clear: no new introduction of grammar schools. And if there was one thing I would correct, Nuala, just one thing from that very good report that you wrote, A Tale of Two Counties, it was that David Cameron, I think you said in 2015, the phrasing of it was that he extended grammar school provision. Well, I wouldn't say that the party officially in the government extended grammar school provision. What they did was they allowed the existing grammar schools in those local counties, responding to what parents demanded in those local counties, whether I agree with that or disagree with it, it was a local decision at a local level. And for me, that's the important decision. This is why I think Labour Party policy is so muddled over this. We have a very mixed economy, a mixed constitution when it comes to education. We have some free schools in areas where free schools are what parents want. If parents don't want free schools in an area because their local state school is fantastic, like the school that I taught in for 17 years, there was no demand for a free school. But if you look at where some free schools have been established in parts of London and are highly successful, it is because the local state school in that area was not good enough. And so a free school, a local free school, non-selective, traditional uniform, rigorous exams, warm, strict behavior, is massively now oversubscribed because of the free school policy that my party brought in 2010. Now, we might want a system that's uniform across the board, no free schools, all comprehensives, no grammar schools. Well, I kind of take my hat off to the Green Party. They are at least consistent. They're not hypocrites. They don't have anyone on their front bench who, well, that's actually another conversation. They don't have anyone on their front bench who sends their child to a selective school and yet officially campaigns against it. There's nothing worse than hypocrisy in politics, nothing worse than that. And I would say, I don't mind what child is sent to what school by their parents, because parents want the best for their children. Would I rather we didn't have grammar schools? Yes, absolutely. In fact, I'd rather every school was a grammar school for the reasons that I outlined. But I would say in terms of the two parties that are not hypocritical about this, it's the Green Party and the Conservative Party.
Wow, Steve, thank you very much indeed. I'm not going to tackle you on all the points, but I've got, you certainly brought some interesting ideas there about how we might perhaps bring in grammar school ideas into the comprehensive system. Okay, that's for other people to deal with. But actually, something I might do, and I'm going to go to questions now. I'm very aware we've got a lot of questions sent in, and we've also got questions from our attendees. But you raised a really interesting point, Stephen. I'm going to use it because Caroline Lucas, another of our patrons and a Green, has also sent in a question, and I hope people won't mind if I queue jump with this one. She's asked the panel this. She says, I would be interested to hear from the panel if there has been a significant change on the way they view selection over the last decade with the rise of choice and competition. So, for example, academies, free schools, LEA, comprehensives and grammar schools. Now, the rise of the mix, she calls it, the rise of choice, have they changed their views on selection with this increased marketization and competition and choice model? I'm paraphrasing what Caroline said, but that honestly was the essence of what she said there. I hope I've been clear, done my best. I'm going to fire it out. I'm going to first give it to Christine. Yes, Christine,
Yeah.
would you mind? Steve's kind of addressed things himself already, and then I know Vix will. Christine, please.
Well, I guess the issue about choice is that I think there's a lot of myth making about choice. And in fact, since the notion of parental choice came into the education system, it has actually been much more about schools choosing children than parents choosing schools. And I think that's the very big issue. Now, when I was General Secretary of the National Union of Teachers, we had a slogan, which I think is a perfectly good slogan, which is a good local school for every child. And although, you know, there might be some differences between us about what a good school looks like and a good local school particularly, the fact is that that is really what most parents would want. They would want their child to go to a local school that is a good school. And of course, the problem with the way parental choice has worked is that you can't necessarily get into your local school because that local school might be choosing other types of children. So it's not so much that my attitude about grammar schools has changed. What has changed is the confusion that has been sown in the minds of parents that they actually have a choice, because in many cases, they have no choice whatsoever. So if we are going to constrain choice, and it seems to me that there are always likely to be some levels of constraint in a universal service, I would prefer that parents had the absolute right to go to a good local school, and there was no question that they wouldn't be able to get into their good local school. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on the whole choice question.
Sorry about that, folks. I'm thinking it might be more interesting for our attendees. Thank you very much for that response. If I now mixed it up a bit, instead of giving the same question to all our panelists, unless someone's busting to answer something, why don't I mix it up? We've got so many questions. It'd be really interesting, if you don't mind, guys. I'm going to field another question. It got a lot of votes, this one. So I would like to put it to you. Now, it's quite detailed. Actually, first I'll do the slightly shorter one. Forgive me, Dimitri, because it's slightly shorter, this one. I hope he won't mind. It encapsulates his idea too. I'm going to fire it at Nigel. My question is why? If everyone is now against inequality, no political party, except possibly the Greens, has made the connection between selection at 11 and inequality. Roger, our patron, Roger Brown, is saying, is it just ignorance, or is something deeper going on? I suspect, Nigel, you've got an answer to that.
Well, as far as the Liberal Democrats are concerned, I think it's fair to say that quite a lot of our people feel that we're now in a situation, it relates actually to the previous question as well. We're now in a situation where still, as Steve said, the vast majority of local authority areas do not have grammar schools. And therefore, I think perhaps some people are a little bit slow to react to possible indications of change back towards grammar schools that exists in some sectors of the population and in the minds of some parents. And with the fragmentation of our system as well, since the introduction of academies and free schools and the demise of local authorities, and therefore less local oversight, because of all of that, the thing is becoming so much more mixed up that it's allowing some people to want to go back to thinking about grammar schools. And we know this does exist in some sections of the population, in spite of the fact that the majority of people who have any influence on these things, as Steve indicated, even amongst Conservatives, do not want to go back to the old days. But in terms of the political scene, as I indicated in my opening, there are some people now in the party who are saying perhaps we need to talk about this more again because of this possibility of some people trying to go back to grammar school.
I wondered if you wouldn't mind addressing the issue of inequality, Nigel. We're talking about inequality. The question was focusing on inequality. I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
Well, there's a lot of clear thinking and research that's gone on, which shows the extremely strong link between the inequalities in society and the inequalities within our system, in spite of having had a comprehensive system for so long. And to me, the answer to this doesn't lie in going back to grammar schools. The answer lies in lots of other ways. Some of the ways that are being tried to improve the situation within schools, but in the last 2 years, there's been a huge number of reports showing that quite a lot of these inequality issues cannot be solved by the schools alone. It's ridiculous, as is often sometimes said, to expect teachers to deal with the ills of society on their own. They have a part to play, but maybe the part they can play is not as great as one sometimes imagines. In 2013, a comprehensive set of research estimated that 80% of the inequalities within the education system are due to the factors outside the school. And last year, a report by the University College London and the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, they did a massive paper in which they said that they reckon now it's 90% of the difficulties of inequality in education that are due to what goes on outside the school. So, thank you,
Nigel. No, that's great. Fair enough.
Link between, what goes on in school and what goes on outside the school is showing more and more that in spite of all the efforts of the education system, we're not dealing enough with the other things that go on around the school.
No, you're so right. Thank you. I'm going to fire this next one. I'm trying desperately to mix them up a bit. And I know there is one there with 5 votes. You're going to hate me, but it's so long, I can't read it all out straight away. So I'm going to now go to Vix, because this question, now this is from Nick Hillman. And of course, he's our head of the HEPI. He's always on about me, always getting to me on this one. And actually, it's a good question, but I'm going to paraphrase it, Nick. I hope you don't mind. And definitely, we've got a webinar coming up where you and I tackle each other on where we select. But Vix, I wonder whether we could answer this one. He suggests the panel opposes the 11+ assent, but the UK has one of the most selective university systems and more selection at 18. Now, let's not deal with that, because that's naughty of Nick. He knows this is about the 11+ and grammar schools. But Vix, he does say something here. At what age, if ever, does selection become acceptable? I wondered if, because you've got such a good policy in the Greens, I thought you might be a good one. What age do you think, if at all, we could have selection? You're allowed to say no, but I'm just interested.
Yeah, I think it depends why we are selecting. I think the notion at 11 is selecting to offer more opportunity and a broadened curriculum, and to, as Steve put it, to push students together and to get them to achieve the best. I'm not sure at university those things apply. I think at university a lot of it is individual self-motivation and aptitude. I'm not sure that ability is as important. Some people with a low prior attainment can do very, very well in a specialism at university. And I see that as an A-level teacher as well. The prior attainment of our pupils does not necessarily mean how good they're going to be at specific smaller subjects such as classics or geology. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question there. I think we are seeing, as the question says, more at 16, more selection at 11, selection all the way through. I think that's more because of the shortage of resources, and that goes down to the fragmented system that we have at the moment, where councils and local authorities cannot create new schools. It's a very fragmented system. which in the coronavirus situation has made it much more difficult to manage in terms of large class sizes and to manage spaces and accessibility then. So yeah, I don't think it's as important to do it at university level as it's made out to be now.
Thank you very much, Vix. Okay, Steve, your turn. I am trying to jumble them up a bit. It is a bit long, forgive me, but it is from our patron, Dimitri Corriton, and I know there are other questions. I'm trying to get to them all. I'm going to try and get it in for you so that you can retain it, because it is long. The OECD's PISA 2018 report was published on Tuesday, and it's the latest in a long line of evidence that shows selection is harmful. At the launch, I'm going to cut this bit, it was drawn attention to the fact that part of the PISA report shows that selection can help individual schools, while at the same time, if they select on ability, but at the same time, it depresses the whole of the education system of the area. So the system doesn't benefit as a whole. I hope I'm making sense. So how far, this question is, how far will this latest research from PISA be taken on board, do you think, by the Tories? I'm going to ask you, do you think that's something that the Tories might take on board, Steve? Is that too much?
No, I mean, it's not saying anything surprising, the report. And I go back to the point that I made earlier, that there is no policy that the Conservative government has or will have in my lifetime, I think, which will say, let's increase the amount of selection in secondary schools. It's just not going to happen. It's like the death penalty. It's an argument from a long time ago. I get the arguments on both sides. I get the people who make the arguments for selection because they think their children will get into the grammar schools. And then when their child doesn't pass the 11 plus, suddenly they're not so keen on grammar schools anymore. If someone's going to stand up and make the case for secondary moderns to me, I will listen to the argument. But of course, no one who makes the case for grammar schools makes the case for the vast majority of pupils that I've taught in my career who don't get into grammar schools. So,
could I just ask you something here, Steve? Sorry, you said something about not, forgive me, what about the Selective School Expansion Fund? That was a Conservative initiative, Theresa May's initiative. Is that not about expanding selection?
Well, that's not current government. That's not current government.
Ah, is it not? Is it not?
No, and it's also not about expanding the grammar school system as if, let's say, the county that I live in, Cambridgeshire, is going to have grammar schools suddenly, or selection will be possible in Cambridgeshire. Where... It
was a backdoor way of expanding grammar schools. Come on, it was. We all know it, Steve.
So
surely.
not into counties where grammar schools didn't exist. And I may sound like I'm weaseling the question here, and I'm deliberately not trying to weasel the question.
No, I know you're not. I know you're not.
Where you have grammar schools at the moment, so that those handful of counties that have grammar schools, that extension fund allowed that grammar school to expand. So there were more pupils who then went to that grammar school, whereas in the years before, there were fewer people that went to that grammar school.
Is that acceptable? As a Conservative, is that acceptable that we expand our given at grammar schools? If we don't, I understand that you don't want to spread them into other counties.
No.
I just want to know, I want clarity.
And nor are we going to advocate a grammar school system for the country. I mean, I go back to the slogan that Christine used a moment ago, where she said, a good local school for every child. And I think that's been a left-wing mantra for many years. I think they believe in it deep down in their hearts. I don't think they're going to do anything to make it happen, because actually there were sync schools that were the local school in towns and villages across the country. And the left was quite happy with that school being a sync school because they blamed it on socioeconomic poor circumstances, ethnic this, disadvantage that. And so they just made excuses why it was a sync school. And then when we came in 2010, we didn't start by advocating increased selection or more grammar schools or the 11 plus roll it out. We said, no, that's unacceptable. And so if you're going to have a head teacher that is going to go in and turn that school around, and I don't care if parents are annoyed because the number of exclusions temporarily increases, but in order to turn that school around to make it a good local school for every child, you don't have parental choice if the parents who live in that locality have no choice but to send their child to that sync school. That is not parental choice. So if we're going to wait another 100 years until there's a good local school for every child, I'm not prepared to wait that long. And if you look at educational standards in England since 2010, and I also put my hat into the ring here and say that the Liberal Democrats were definitely advancing policies that I agreed with during that coalition government. But since 2010, educational standards in England have improved. That is demonstrably true. Across the board, universally, no. If you look at where they've improved, it's because head teachers have been given the powers to take a school bull by the horns and turn that school around. No excuses whatsoever. And you compare that with Scotland since 2010, and the decline in Scotland educational standards is frightening. And I say that as a Scot. The SNP government is looking at what they're doing in England and saying, we're going to do exactly.
Okay, thank you, Steve. I'm so glad I'm chair here, because I would be coming right in at you. But well done, a great answer. Now, I think Christine has a right to answer back. I hope you don't mind. You did say some things there about all those Saint schools and the blinking ethnic minorities. I think we should give someone a chance.
I said blinking ethnic minorities.
Say blinking. You didn't, but you implied it, Steve. You implied it. Come on, come on.
The left made it.
Stand up for what you said. Listen, I'll be quiet. Christine, give us an answer.
Well, I think it's simply this. I mean, it's often said, and I sat in an office with Michael Gove where he tried to say it to me, that somehow or other, either teachers or people who saw themselves on the left or whoever were wanting to defend a poor quality outcome or a poor experience for any child in any school. And that simply is not what those of us who've been teachers get up every morning and go to work to do. What we get up every morning to go to work to do is to improve the lives of young people. And interestingly, Steve, when you opened on your, as you say, slightly disingenuous thing about reasons why you support grammar schools, you started on the business about disadvantage should not be an excuse. And my take on that is that disadvantage should never be an excuse, but there are circumstances in which it is a reason. And that's why I favour differential funding for the kinds of schools that Nigel was talking about, where actually you have got a high level of kids arriving in school who come from certain disadvantaged areas. Now, it's terribly interesting to me that this current Conservative government have suddenly discovered inequality during the time when schools have been closed and we were all in lockdown. Because of course, if you live in a home that has excellent broadband, incidentally, isn't free universal broadband a good idea by way of a policy now? Anyway, if you live in a house that has very poor broadband or no kind of kit on which you can access it, and you don't have parents at home who can assist in any kind of way, then your experience during the COVID lockdown will have been different. So it simply just is the case, as Nigel said, and as the OECD often finds, that if there is inherent disadvantage in some sectors of society, then it's important that the education system does what it can to improve that, to kind of level the playing field on those bases. Now, I don't necessarily agree with you that that's best done by a Barathea blazer. I think, I have a very mixed view about school uniform. My own elder daughter always wanted to go to a mixed school with what she described when she was 9 years old as no costume. And she went to Holland Park, she did extremely well, she went to Edinburgh University, had a fabulous time. So I don't necessarily agree with you about uniform. What I do think is that schools they do have to have a broad and balanced curriculum. There are not subjects to which some children should not be exposed because we think they're going to be too hard. That's nonsense. That's absolute nonsense. It's like saying a 4-year-old can't understand classical music. It's some kind of weird idea that we used to have that, some children can do this and some children can do that. Nonsense. It's nonsense. So I agree with you about the breadth of curriculum. I agree with you about having a framework of behaviour so that children know what's expected, because no child wants to feel out of control. No child wants to feel that when they're in school, they don't know whether they're allowed to do this or that. I think that's important too. But I do think that what you said about disadvantage and how you have to kind of pull people up by the scruff of the neck is not entirely the way to do it. Well, you didn't say that. You didn't say that. But what you said was, any school can do as well as any other school. And I'm saying they need the resources to make sure that they can, because I don't think anyone goes to school to try and make sure that a child has a bad experience. They just don't.
Thank you very much, Christine. Now, I know we're running, it's a bit tight, and I'm probably cheating here because it will have to be the last one. So I hope you'll allow me. If you've got to go, just go. But I got such great questions. There's one from Melissa Ben here, one from David Chater, who's on our steering committee, and also our patron, David Melvin. So what I'm going to do is cheat. I'm going to try and push them together. I want to just state that Melissa's made quite clear, and I know it's been said, that, you know, selection depresses overall achievement, and it is unjust. But both David Chater and David Melville, our patron, were suggesting, you know, come on, you guys, how would you phase out or abolish grammar schools, and why won't the parties do it? Why will they not? If we can, as Steve has suggested, get a really good comprehensive with uniforms and Latin and rugby, why can't we then get rid of grammar schools, for goodness sakes? So it's a bit of a mishmash there of things and ideas. Why can't we just get rid of them, and why won't the parties get rid of grammar schools? We don't need them. Okay, quickly, you've got about a second each to answer. That's a bit. Start with Vix and then Nigel. Vix.
Well, yeah, we've got grammar schools, we've got free schools, we've got academies. There's a huge fragmentation. My school that I teach at is the only local authority state school that's not an academy on the Isle of Wight. And we teach Latin. My son is doing GCSE Latin. You do not need to be a grammar school or a free school to have an academically vigorous curriculum. Neither do you need to be even a technically good school. All the school my children are at are either inadequate or require improvement, and they're very happy and they are achieving. These labels are not helpful for anybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a great answer. Your kids are happy. Nigel, come on then. Why can't we just get...
I just want to repeat what I said earlier about bearing in mind what goes on outside the school and the need for other things like youth services and so on to work closely with the schools. But leaving that within the school system itself, as far as selection is concerned, as Steve hinted at within the Conservative Party, in the Liberal Democrats, we tend to be very much in favour of localism. And therefore, what goes on in a local area is important for them to work things out for themselves. But having said that, I think there is a growing feeling now, even in the Liberal Democrats, that in those areas where like Kent and one or two others, where we have some good strength of Liberal Democrats, and yet there are grammar schools, I think our party needs to start thinking how we can work with those local people to change things and eventually get rid of the grammar schools.
Brilliant, thanks. Okay, come on, Steve, your turn. Why can't we just get rid of them? We've got fantastic comprehensives. You've told me all about them. Why can't we get rid of grammar schools?
Well, not all comprehensives are brilliant, and not all grammar schools are brilliant. I like this idea that somehow if children go to grammar schools, they'll get a good education. It's like if children go to an independent school and parents are paying for it, they'll get a good education. It's just nonsense. Some grammar schools are very good. Some grammar schools are not very good at all.
Why don't we just get rid of them then?
Well, again, going back to Nigel's point, interestingly, about localism, no one is talking about expanding them into other counties. Where they exist at the moment, would I choose to design an education system with grammar schools? No, I wouldn't. But nor would I choose to design an education system with so much inequality in it. However, you work with what you have and you improve what you have. Christine and I, it was interesting, she was saying before about the disadvantage in schools. Christine, you're an English teacher by background, I think, is that right?
Modern foreign languages.
Oh, I got that totally wrong. Okay, in which case, I don't know if you're aware, but there's a study, the 30 million word gap, that by the age of 3, children from very advantaged homes, highly literate, books in the house, read bedtime stories, by the age of 3, they've already come across 30 million more words than children who are from homes where no one works, where there are no books in the house, serious disadvantage. So by the time you start in primary school, that gap is already enormous. So
why can't we get rid of grammar schools though? Sorry, can I get you back to the question?
But again, it goes back to this point that you start with where you're at. If children are starting in primary school, no, let's ignore the 11 plus, and they start with the same curriculum, then by the time they get to secondary school, we're giving those children advantages. Personally, I'm not in favor of the 11 plus. Would I abolish it in those counties by diktat from Westminster? No. Why
not? Why not?
Because if parents in Kent want to get rid of the grammar schools, then Kent will be under a lot of pressure to get rid of grammar schools. If parents in Kent want to keep them, Kent will keep them.
So you think it's up? Okay, fair enough. No, I mustn't. We can have another debate another time. Okay, quickly then, Christine, and I suppose I must wrap it up.
Okay, well, I'm agreeing. I am agreeing with a lot of what the other panelists, and in particular with what Steve has had to say. I mean, one of the things that I would say is that, you know, there's that old saying about turkeys not voting for Christmas. And the issue is which parents are in the ballot to decide whether you have grammar schools or not. And that's the issue. I think we would be rid of grammar schools if we had a fairer system of deciding whether a county wanted to keep them or not. So in a sense, the way to get rid of grammar schools is to have a much more open debate about it, but also to have a fairer system for determining how that would work. And just in closing, I refer you to a very old episode of Yes, Minister. Older folk like me will remember this, when the hapless minister is talking to his aide, and his aide is saying, "You do know, don't you, Minister, why we had to get rid of grammar schools?" And the hapless minister says, "Well, it's the parents. They didn't want them, did they? They didn't want them." And the aide says, "No, Minister, it was the National Union of Teachers."
Wretched teachers. They're to blame for everything, as we know. Anyway, great. A wonderful note. I'm glad we ended on a light note. But actually it's a really serious subject, and I know I've got to wrap it up here. Look, we've covered a lot here, and Nigel brought us into the idea of social mobility, and I know people have argued there is no social mobility. In fact, the very latest report has shown grammar schools do not bring social mobility, so there's issues of social justice there. Christine has talked about rejection, not selection. And Steve has shown us a very different model of doing comprehensive education. I understand what he's saying. I'm not sure I totally agree, but thank you, Steve, for being really good, because you've wanted this debate for a long time, and I hope you feel you've got it, you know, being challenged a bit on your ideas. And Vix, really interesting to get your ideas about just really, I suppose I liked all your personal references, if I'm going to be honest. You have really good grounded experience personally as a teacher, from your parents and even your children, and also what you're doing in really happy schools in the Isle of Wight, which is really great to hear. And of course, they're comprehensive. I would end on that note, wouldn't I? I'm going to wrap it up now. I know I haven't covered all the questions. I know I didn't get all the points in. What can I say? It's been such an interesting evening, and thank you so much to all our speakers. You've done a really magnificent job. We've thrashed a lot of things out. There's more to do, I think. There is far more to discuss here, and I'm very aware lots of loose ends haven't been tied up. I'm going to say good night from all of us, Comprehensive Future. Thank you very much to all the people who've attended. Thank you so much for all your questions and your chat. It's been a really great evening. Okay, I'm going to sign off here. Thanks again. Bye-bye.